In December 2022, the leaders of the G7 nations announced what they called the most powerful economic weapon ever deployed in peacetime, a price cap, specifically a $60 per barrel ceiling on Russian crude oil. The logic was clean. Russia needed Western shipping companies to move its oil. It needed Western insurers to cover those ships. It needed Western banks to finance the transactions, cut off access to all three at once, and Russia faced a choice: sell its oil at the price the West dictated, or don't sell it at all. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called it a masterstroke. Analysts predicted Russian oil revenues would collapse. Economists modeled a scenario where Russia's war machine would begin running dry within months. Within 6 weeks, approximately 600 ships appeared from nowhere. They had no Western insurance, no Western financing, no transponders broadcasting their location. They were old, many of them aging tankers that had been quietly purchased, reflagged under obscure jurisdictions, and handed to shell companies with no traceable ownership. And they were moving Russian oil, at prices well above $60 a barrel, to buyers who had quietly decided the West's sanctions were someone else's problem. This is the shadow fleet, and this is why the most coordinated sanctions regime in modern history is failing in the open ocean. To understand the shadow fleet, you have to understand what made the price cap work on paper. Russia exports roughly 7 to 8 million barrels of oil per day. Moving that volume requires tankers, large, expensive vessels that cost tens of millions of dollars to operate. For decades, the global tanker industry was dominated by Western companies, Greek shipping firms, Norwegian operators, and a handful of major players in the UK and Japan. More importantly, virtually every commercial tanker on Earth was insured by one of 13 protection and indemnity clubs, almost all of them based in London. This is called P&I insurance, and without it, no port in the world will let you dock. No reputable buyer will accept your cargo. No canal authority will let you transit. The G7's calculation was this: control the insurance, control the ships, control the ships, control the oil, control the oil, control Russia's war funding. It was a legitimate theory, for about 6 weeks. What the architects of the price cap underestimated was that Russia had been watching Iran for 40 years. Iran has lived under oil sanctions since 1979. In that time, Iranian traders, brokers, and state officials built an entirely parallel infrastructure for moving crude oil outside the Western financial system. Fake documentation, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to obscure the origin of the cargo. Falsified manifests listing the oil as coming from Iraq or Oman. Shell companies layered across Dubai, Hong Kong, and the Seychelles. When Russia needed to move oil outside Western oversight in late 2022, it didn't have to invent anything. The infrastructure already existed. Russian oligarchs and state traders plugged into networks that Iranian brokers had been running for decades and began buying up old tankers at a rate that shocked the shipping industry. Between late 2022 and mid-2023, an estimated 400 to 600 older tankers, vessels typically over 15 years old, past their prime from major shipping companies, were purchased by entities that trace back to Dubai, Hong Kong, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. Many were reflagged under Gabon, Cameroon, Palau, or other nations that ask very few questions and charge very low fees. The new owners had one thing in common: they were not Western. They did not need Western insurance. They self-insured, or used Russian state-backed coverage, or simply accepted the risk. And they had buyers, because India and China were waiting. Here is the part of the shadow fleet story that never gets discussed in Western media. The price cap only works if the buyers comply. The United States and Europe are not buying Russian oil anymore. But India and China together import more oil than the entire European Union combined, and neither of them signed on to the price cap. India in particular has been explicit about this. Indian officials have publicly stated that India buys energy where it can at the best price, and that Western sanctions on Russia are not Indian policy. In 2021, India imported almost no Russian crude. By 2023, Russia had become India's single largest oil supplier, accounting for nearly 40% of Indian imports. China's pattern has been identical, just quieter. Chinese state refiners, Sinopec, CNOC, PetroChina, have all been increasing purchases of Russian Urals crude, Iranian crude, and Venezuelan barrels at discounted prices, all moved by shadow fleet tankers and settled in currencies other than the dollar. What this means in practice is that the price cap hasn't cut Russia off from oil revenue. It has cut Russia off from Western oil revenue, which is different. Russian oil still flows. It just now flows east, at prices the West doesn't control, on ships the West doesn't insure. And the numbers prove it. In 2023, Russia earned an estimated $190 billion in oil and gas revenue, down from the record $338 billion in 2022, but still enough to fund its military operations at full scale. The International Energy Agency concluded that Russian oil production had barely declined. The Kremlin had absorbed the sanctions routed around them and continued financing a war that Western policymakers had predicted would be economically strangled within the first year. So why can't the West simply intercept these ships? The honest answer is jurisdiction. Shadow fleet tankers operate in international waters, flying the flags of non-Western nations. The United States cannot board a vessel flying a Gabonese flag in the Indian Ocean and seize its cargo without triggering an international incident. The UK cannot order a Cameroonian flagged ship to stop transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The West can sanction individual ships, and it has. The US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has added hundreds of shadow fleet vessels to its sanctions list. But here is the problem. The moment a ship gets sanctioned, its owners simply transfer the cargo to a different vessel, reflag under a different nation, and continue operating. The fleet is hydra-shaped, cut off one ship and two more appear. There is also a political dimension that rarely gets acknowledged. Several of the countries whose flags the shadow fleet uses are developing nations that have been explicitly told by the United States that they must enforce Western sanctions or face consequences. Many of them have pointed out, not unreasonably, that they did not vote for these sanctions, they were not consulted on them, and they see no reason to sacrifice their own economic relationships with Russia on behalf of a conflict in Europe. The West has not been entirely passive. In June 2024, the G7 introduced its most aggressive countermeasure yet, secondary sanctions. The idea was to threaten any non-Western company, Indian refiners, Turkish banks, Chinese shipping brokers that did business with shadow fleet tankers carrying above-cap Russian oil. If you touch these ships, the West warned, you lose access to the US financial system. It created a moment of genuine concern in the market. Several Indian refiners briefly paused purchases. A handful of Turkish banks stopped processing payments. For about 3 weeks, there were signs that secondary sanctions might succeed where the price cap alone had not. Then the purchases resumed. The Turkish banks found workarounds through UAE intermediaries. The Indian refiners adjusted their payment channels to route through currencies and correspondent banks outside US jurisdiction. Within a month, shadow fleet traffic was back to previous levels. The fundamental problem is one of scale. The US financial system is powerful, but it is not the only financial system. As long as Russia, China, India, Iran, Turkey, and the UAE are all willing to settle transactions in rubles, yuan, rupees, and dirhams, the dollar-denominated leverage that makes secondary sanctions work begins to lose its grip. There is one dimension of the shadow fleet that almost no one is talking about, and it may be the most dangerous. These ships have no real insurance. A modern oil tanker can carry 2 million barrels of crude. If one runs aground, or collides, or catches fire in a sensitive maritime environment, the resulting spill would be catastrophic. Under the normal shipping system, the P&I clubs cover cleanup costs, compensation to affected nations, and liability claims. The coverage can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Shadow fleet ships have none of that. Their Russian or self-provided coverage is not recognized by most coastal nations. If one of these vessels sinks in the Danish Straits, or runs aground off the coast of Malaysia, or catches fire in the Strait of Malacca, the legal and financial liability lands on no one because the ship belongs to a shell company in a jurisdiction that has nothing to pay. In January 2024, this stopped being theoretical. A Russian shadow fleet tanker called the Andromeda Star suffered a serious engine failure in the Baltic Sea. Danish authorities scrambled. The vessel was eventually stabilized. Then, in January 2025, Finnish Coast Guard forces actually boarded and seized a shadow fleet tanker called the Eagle S, a Cook Islands flagged vessel suspected of cutting an undersea data cable connecting Finland and Estonia. The boarding was unprecedented. It was the first time a Western nation had physically seized a shadow fleet ship, and it revealed something the authorities had not fully anticipated. The vessel was in such severe disrepair that maritime inspectors described it as a floating safety violation. These are not modern, well-maintained vessels operating at the margins of respectability. They are aging ships bought cheaply, operated with minimal oversight, crewed by sailors who may not have been paid in months, transiting waters where a single catastrophic failure could devastate coastlines that stretch across multiple sovereign nations. So what does all of this tell us? The shadow fleet is not a workaround, it is a restructuring. What Russia, Iran and Venezuela have collectively done, with the participation of India, China, Turkey and the UAE as willing buyers and intermediaries, is build an entirely parallel oil trading system that operates outside the dollar, outside Western insurance, outside Western shipping, and outside Western legal jurisdiction. The G7 price cap was designed on the assumption that the West controlled the critical infrastructure of global trade, and in 2022 that was still largely true. But the shadow fleet has demonstrated that critical infrastructure can be replicated, slowly, expensively, imperfectly, if the motivation is strong enough and the buyers are large enough. India and China represent 35% of global oil demand. When they decide that Western sanctions are not their problem, the math changes entirely. The price cap doesn't cap the price. It creates a two-tier global oil market. One where the West pays market rates and one where sanctioned exporters sell to the non-Western world at whatever price they can negotiate. And here is the thing about that two-tier market. It does not stay two-tier. Over time, the shadow infrastructure becomes the real infrastructure. The brokers get more sophisticated, the payment rails get faster, the insurance alternatives get more credible, the flag of convenience nations get more comfortable. What started as an emergency workaround for Russia is now a permanent feature of the global economy. And the implications extend far beyond Russia. Every sanctioned nation on earth has been watching. Iran watched, Venezuela watched, North Korea watched. They have all seen that if you can move enough volume to enough willing buyers, the architecture of Western financial pressure can be navigated around, not easily, not cheaply, but permanently. The shadow fleet is not just a Russian story, it is a proof of concept. A demonstration that the financial order the West built over 80 years can be bypassed by anyone with enough ships, enough buyers, and enough patience. The 600 ships that appeared in 6 weeks were not an accident, they were a signal. A signal that the era of Western financial dominance over global commodity trade is not permanent, and that the nations who want to operate outside that system now have a proven model for how to do it. The question is not whether the shadow fleet will keep growing, it will. The question is what the West does when it realizes that the most powerful economic weapon it has ever deployed is being dismantled in international waters, one aging tanker at a time, by ships that nobody officially owns. So far, nobody has a good answer.